Okay, this is a particularly important problem. I crossed out something because I thought it was a little bit weird, but it says the Lopez family lives 400 miles from Denver. They drive at a constant speed of 50 miles an hour. Now the function gives their distance in miles from Denver after X hours. So basically what that's trying to say is that the Lopez family is at home and they're driving to Denver. They have 400 miles to go before they get there. So when they start out, at the very beginning of time, they have 400 miles to go. Now, every hour they go, they drive 50 miles, which means that after they drive 1 hour, now they only have to go 350 miles because they're driving 50 miles per hour. And then, of course, after 2 hours, they only have 300 miles to go, and so on and so forth. So now, just by that, you can see how you would write an equation. Now, they give it to you, but I want to show you how you got to write it because on the test you might have to write an equation. So we know that this is the y-intercept because right there is where x is 0. So in that case, b would be 400. But then we got to look at what's changing. That's the important part. The slope is always what's changing. And in this case, the distance is changing. The distance is actually going down by 50 miles every time. And we know that down is actually just negative, which means that you could say that your slope is really just negative 50, or it's decreasing by 50 miles. So if you use these two pieces of information, you would write y equals negative 50x plus 400. And if you look, that's exactly what they gave you when they gave you up here. It's just a little bit out of order. So now you have to graph that. So let me put some labels on this graph. Okay, here are my labels. So we graph 0, 400, of course. That's our first point, and it's actually our y-intercept, 0, 400. Write the coordinates there. And then we have 1, 350, 2, 300, and so on. You can start to see how the slope changes. And in fact, if you keep going with this pattern, you'll find out that this is the point where they get to Denver, right at 8 hours, which is right there. And you can just see that in the graph. So let's look a little bit further down. It says, write an equation in point-slope form. Now, we already know what the slope is, so that's helpful. And we already have a bunch of points. So let's see, what's your favorite point? Let's pick this one, 2, 300. Now, the standard form for point-slope looks like this. This is blank with nothing filled in. Now you have to fill in the slope and the x1 and the y1. So the x1 and the y1 come from this point right here, 2 and 300. So you're going to go y minus 300 since that's the y part of the point. And then our slope, which we already wrote down, is negative 50. And then x minus, and the x part of that same point that we circled is 2. And there you go. You don't have to do anything else. So now the next thing says, what does the slope represent? You're always going to have to mention the x-axis and the y-axis in the slope. Once again, you have to mention the x-axis and the y-axis. The x-axis is hours, and the y-axis is miles. Now, the slope represents the number of miles driven per hour to Denver. Notice I included miles and hours in that sentence. Okay, what does each intercept represent? Super important. Now the y-intercept we wrote down way up at the top was 0, 400. Very important. You have to include both of the numbers in your answer. So the y-intercept represents that at the beginning, which is 0 time, this is representing the 0, at the beginning, 0 time, they had 400 miles to go. So notice that at the beginning, this represents your 0, they had 400 miles to go. That represents the 400. You have to include both numbers of the points. But then they also want to know what the x-intercept represents. And we looked and saw that the x-intercept was actually 8, 0, because we know that that means that they arrived after 8 hours and had 0 miles to go. Seems like a ridiculously robotic sentence, but that's exactly what you have to write, because you have to represent the 8 and you have to represent the 0. Extremely important. So all of those things have to be mentioned in the problem. That was confusing. There you go.